Okay, well, I have 7 o'clock, so let's go ahead and begin. I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible, but at the same time, I don't want to sacrifice, you guys learning something. So if there is a time when I think that something has to be enunciated, I will go ahead and enunciate it. To begin, why am I doing this? Well, at Georgia State University, we have many different clubs. I just happen to be the president of the computer science club, and we're working on numerous different projects. One of the projects that we're working on currently is building our computer science club website in PHP, specifically using CodeIgniter. So I figured since a lot of people need the practice to go ahead and do a live event where we can get an introduction into building a website through a framework as simple as CodeIgniter. So there are going to be a lot of different terms that are going to be thrown around in the industry. You're just going to have to get used to them. So I hope that with this, you're going to be a little bit more acquainted with it, and everything's going to make a little bit more sense. Before we begin, one of the crucial things that you're going to have is a text editor, something like Sublime. I preferably use um, something like JetBrains PHP Storm. I just kind of like it more. Fills in everything for me for the most part. But Sublime will work, and we just need it primarily because of this folder structure right here. So with a framework, you're going to have a bunch of different folders that you're going to have to navigate, and it's just a lot easier if you have them in view as you do in Sublime. The next thing, and I hope everybody has done this, has installed it. If not, it's time to go ahead and do it right now, is to get something like WAMP server. All right, so there are many different flavors of WAMP. I mean, there's LAMP for Linux, MAMP for Apple, and WAMP for Windows. So WAMP, Windows, Apache, MySQL, and PHP uh, is something that you need in order to run PHP code and be able to connect to a database on your local environment. Before we even, well, I guess right now would be the time to download it, but I'll explain a little bit more in detail um, why we need this. So just click download. It'll take you to the bottom of the screen. Depending if you have a 64-bit architecture or 32-bit, you're going to be downloading either or. How can you check? Just open up any folder, right click on your PC if you're using Windows 10, click Properties, and right here it says System Type 64-bit. For other systems, I believe you can type in DXDIAG, so DXDIAG, and right here you'll be able to see operating system. And for example, mine's 64-bit. So for me, I would click 64-bit. It would open up this little modal. I can click on download directly, and it'll take me to this page. Now, I've seen WAMP is having issues with this, or SourceForge is, I guess. So you can just close that out, and you can just say, looking for the latest version, download this right here, and it'll start downloading. For me, I don't need to download it because I use this quite often. But once you download it, just run it. Everything default, next, next, next. And after everything's finished installing, you can turn it on by clicking on the WAMP server icon. It may not be present. You may have to find it in your program files. How do you know it's running? In your taskbar, you'll see hopefully a green WAMP server icon. If you click on this, there are some folders and files that we're not going to go through too much. For me, the www directory or localhost would take me to something different just because I have it configured differently. One other thing, if you guys ever getting to a point where you're doing some kind of framework like Laravel, another PHP framework, you're going to have to make sure that you have 7 point something. On this computer I have 7.0.10. It's literally as easy as switching between here. If you look up tutorials online, how to switch between the two, they'll go through all kinds of complicated stuff, but literally you just click it, it'll restart, and you're good to go. You may have to set the environmental path variable to point to the 7.0, and then you can verify by going to like command prompt and typing in php-v. But that's not the point of this tutorial, that's just a little extra tidbit. And hopefully I've given you enough time to go ahead and download and install WAMP server if you haven't already. The next thing we're going to need is CodeIgniter, right? So we can go to CodeIgniter.com and we can click download, and that will download the latest one. I've already have one downloaded, so we're going to be extracting this one pretty soon. I also recommend that you open up this website address, w3schools.com/w3css/w3css_templates, or you can just go to Google, type in W3 Schools free templates, and it's that first link right there. So that'll bring you to this, where we're going to be using some of this code that they've written as far as HTML and CSS. And once you install and run WAMP server, you can, if it's green, you can go to your internet browser and you can type in localhost, and it will take you to the WAMP main page. Where is that located? For you guys, it's going to be probably in your C drive, WAMP 64. If you installed the 64-bit architecture, and you're going to click this www folder. So this is where you're going to be creating something new, right? So for example, once we extract CodeIgniter, we'll extract it into this folder. For you, I'll be extracting it somewhere else. You can also create a new folder in here. Let's say, I don't know, tutorials. And then you can go to localhost/tutorials, and it'll take you to that directory. Okay, for the time being, I guess let's go ahead and extract CodeIgniter. So I'm just going to want to extract all, and I'll take it. I can just extract there, that's fine. It'll take a few minutes, depending on speed of your hard drive and everything like that, but it should be pretty effortless, right? With other frameworks, you're going to be going through a much different process. Not with CodeIgniter. CodeIgniter is very simple. That's why I chose it, so that we can go ahead and do that, right? Okay, so we'll call this, I'll just rename it to homepage, and I'll go ahead and move it into my folder. Yeah, so I'll just go ahead and paste that there. I can go ahead and at this point, I'll keep this one open. Close that, and if I refresh, you'll see that homepage has been listed right here as a directory. If I click on it, this is the default CodeIgniter page. It's the same thing as going to index.php, but Apache knows to look for an index.whatever file, like .html or .php, whatever. So it'll find it automatically if you just go into this directory, and it'll load this welcome to CodeIgniter. So literally setting up CodeIgniter is that easy. The next thing that I kind of want to talk about is a lot of people are confused, you know, how all this stuff's stored, why we need WAMP and all that stuff, especially if you're new to web development. So I figured I'd go ahead and draw it out for you guys, right? So in most desktop applications, you know, you have your computer. You'll create some kind of whatever, like for example, Java code, right? You'll compile that Java code into bytecode, and the Java JVM is going to be able to interpret it, and it's all done here on your computer, right? With web development, of course, you want to give access to what you see to a lot of different people, right? So let's say, there's some guy over here, and he has his laptop. He wants to access a web page. That it's going to go through his router. It's going to go through a bunch of different, nodes, and it's going to end up in this computer, right? Because the web address that he typed in gets translated into an IP address, and that's the IP address of probably this router, and this router knows how to route it into this computer. Now, this computer is actually a server, and it's running something like, for example, just for simplicity's sake, like WAMP, right, or LAMP. And it knows how to process the request, right? So if somebody's going to, example.com, and example.com just happens to be hosted on this server, the signal will travel all the way over here. Let's say this was, a default index.php file. The WAMP software is going to be able to, Apache is going to be able to go through here, extract, run the code, generate the HTML, and it's going to send the HTML page back to this guy's laptop, and he's going to be able to see the HTML content, right? So he'll never actually see any of the PHP code that was written in here. He'll just be able to, see HTML. So now we want to be, instead of moving, you could technically get yourself a hosting account right now on somewhere like, GoDaddy or Total Choice Hosting on one of those. And you can upload all your code and see if it runs on there. But for development, you want to be able to run it somewhere closer to home, right? So preferably on your computer. So you go ahead and you install the same software that's running here. You install it on your computer, right? Now, this, in all honesty, you could configure a router, and other people now, with their laptops, would be able to access your server, right? Because you're mimicking technically a server. But we don't want to give them access, right? We just want to be able to test this. It's just saying you could technically, right? In here, once you install this WAMP software, WAMP gives you the capability to go to localhost. And localhost is also the same thing as typing in 127.0.0.1, right? And it directs you automatically to C, WAMP, or WAMP64, and the www folder, right? So if you put anything inside this folder, you could just say /, like for example, let's say in www, you put ABC folder, you can go to ABC now. If you put in some kind of file like index.php, you can go to index.php, right? So it's important that you understand this. Now, let's go back to this server right here. Every once in a while, especially for some of these larger companies, they'll have separate computers, and they'll just, run a database right here, right? So they'll have database where they can store certain things, and then they'll basically link these two computers, and they'll communicate and all kinds of stuff, right? But for us, we want to be able to have access to the database on our own computer. So it does give us access, right? And especially if you install WAMP or LAMP or MAMP, you're going to be able to access the PHPMyAdmin utility, right? So the way you access that is by going to localhost / PHPMyAdmin. So what is PHPMyAdmin? Instead of you writing all kinds of SQL code, you want to basically have a graphical way of doing that, right? So here's PHPMyAdmin. We'll come back and we'll revisit this eventually. But you'll be able to create a new database right here. You can also click database right here. Database name, go ahead and create it. And then we're going to start adding tables, right? I guess I'll go ahead and just create a database called homepage. And within that, we're going to start creating some tables eventually, right? We can specify columns and do all kinds of pretty cool stuff. Okay, now that I've extracted CodeIgniter, right, into this folder, the YouTube folder, I want to be able to open this folder up in something like Sublime or PHPMyAdmin or wherever, right? So I have something opened up already that I was working on, but let's just go here. I'll open this up and I'll select that. I'll open it up in a new window, and there's my homepage folder, right? So this gave me, this is all CodeIgniter's doing right here. Gave me access to this application, system, and user guide. Most of the time we're going to spend within the application. The other folder that I like to create right away is the assets folder. So this is, these are folders like your CSS files, your JavaScript files, anything that the client really can see. So for example, image, folder. The other folder that we're going to do, for example, JS and CSS. Okay, but we're not going to worry about that too much right now. What we do want to do is basically learn how to use this, right? Before we get into that, we can add this, for example. We can add a new HTML file, and I'll just name it index.html, and that's within the assets folder, right? So just the general structure of HTML, you have your doc type, language, head, gives you some meta, title. The title gets displayed basically in the menu bar up there in your browser. So for example, this title is web server, browser files. You can actually see what the HTML code looks like for any page by right-clicking, click and view page source, and you can see all the different HTML, right? So it looks very similar. There's some style right here that they put in, and then they wrap this thing in a div ID. There's H1 tags. There are all kinds of different tags for HTML. So if you're not really too acquainted, I suggest you get acquainted pretty quick, right? So title, for example, Dino Kajic, and we're going to do a heading, my first page, and then below that we'll put something in a paragraph. And this is just a test, right? We'll save that, and if we go to right here, we can go into that assets folder, right? And it loads that index.php. So there's the title, there's the H1, and there's the paragraph tag. If we inspect the source right here, there we go. We can see that all that stuff is in there, right? But how do we do stuff with PHP? What is the purpose of PHP, right? Let's say that we're storing thousands of contacts, right? I mean, there's just thousands of contacts within our database. And we want to display a page for each one of those contacts. It's going to be pretty unrealistic to do a page for 1,000, especially if you start getting into more like 10,000, right? So you're going to have to create an individual page for every single one of those. Well, you don't necessarily want to do that. You want to be able to, let's open up our little diagram, right? You want to be able to pull the information from the database, bring it back here, and then depending on some kind of variable, right, some kind of request, you're going to be able to, I'm looking at some of that. I can see your chat box right now. I just looked over. I moved it over. Let me see if I can move that, or if I can actually just go ahead. There we go. I'll go ahead and turn off my face so that we can go ahead and process that, right? So 3 screens, and it's a little bit all over the place. But anyways, where were we? So we're gonna specify a certain variable, right? Like for example, I want to select where ID is equal to 5 within our database. It's gonna retrieve only that entry, which just happens to be not my name, for example, and you're gonna be able to spit that out. Okay, so how do we do that, right? We're not going to go ahead and create a database for that right now. We're just going to go ahead and simulate it, right? So if you want some kind of file, right? If you want to be able to do any kind of PHP, you're going to need a PHP file. So we'll go ahead and name this index.php. We'll go ahead and copy all this from our index.html, and we don't need index.html anymore. And within index.php, we can literally paste it like that. If we go ahead and refresh, that'll just pull up the same thing, because remember, it's always looking for an index file. And there's index.php. Let's go ahead and start doing some interesting stuff, right? No need to do that. All right, so before, right, most people would just do this. They'll just open up a little PHP script and they'll go ahead and embed some code, right? So we're going to go ahead and embed some code in here, just the previous way. So we're going to create a variable, and we're just going to, let's just name them contacts, right? And we'll create it, basically a contacts array. So within that array, you can have in PHP either values or key value pairs, right? So what are, let's take a look at both, right? So that's going to be a value, some other guy, Frank Ramirez is a guy I know. It's fine. Steven Johnson is the name that I always use if people ask me, like, what is your name short for? I would say Steven Johnson. So, all right, so now we have a contacts array. Before we continue, I want to introduce var dump. And var dump is an amazing way to just see what are you doing. So imagine if you pulled all this information, you stored it into an array from a database, you technically would not be able to see this data cleanly like this. So you want to be able to see what it looks like. So if we go back and we var dump, there we go. It says array 0 string Cagic. It gives you the lengths and all that kind of stuff, right? So just like any other language, you have your loops. You have your for loop, while loop, and then even in Java you have your enhanced for loop, as they call it. PHP, you have a for each loop, right? So what does for each do? So for each contacts as a specific, for example, contact, right? You can name this whatever you want. You can say value, but we're going to name it contact, right? So for each contacts as contact, we're going to echo contact, right? So this is basically saying for each element within the contacts array, print out the element, right? In this case, it'll print out all 4. And let's actually see what happens, right? It's going to print them out in one line. So if we do that, there we go. Print them all out in one line. So how do we get them into different lines? Well, we have to use a little bit of HTML, right? So there's the period right here that is basically the concatenation. In Java, it would be the plus symbol. But we specified this break tag in HTML. Break means go to the next line, right? Okay, and there we go. We printed that out, right? Now we can do all kinds of weird stuff, right? We can actually escape out of PHP. We can, for example, if you start getting into Bootstrap or any one of those CSS frameworks, right? You'll have something called a container, so you can say div ID container, div class row, all kinds of stuff. And let's say we want to do h1 And then within here, we'll go ahead and embed PHP again, right? So as you can see, we're getting out of PHP, we're printing out some HTML, and then we're putting in some PHP in there again, right? And like I said, this starts getting a little messy like that, but I kind of like it, to tell you the truth. Let's open that up. As you can see now, everything's H1. Let's do a couple more real quick ones, right? A lot of the times you may do, let's actually do a different loop, right? So that you can see what that looks like in the round. So let's do a for loop. For I is equal to 0, I is less than, I think it's size, yeah, size of contacts, I++, not contacts. So now we're looping through just like a standard array, right? And we can say echo contacts I to go ahead and display the I. And it's going to print them all into the same line. There we go. The other thing that we can do is, for example, well, let's get out of it, right? So let's start making it more confusing again. So let's go ahead and create a link, and link to, actually, you know what? We're going to go ahead and do it this way, right? So we're going to go ahead and echo out the contact's name. So once we echo out the contact's element at specific I, it's going to display the name. But we also want to do a link, right? So we can say something like, I don't know, echo, let's see what the link is currently. Okay, let's make it even more confusing, right? Let's just paste that in there, and then afterwards, let's add another piece of PHP and say echo I, right? So now this is going to put in the value of I, and this is going to put in the element that it's currently at within the contacts array. So let's go ahead and afterwards, let's go ahead and put in a break tag, right? After each link. All right, let's see what that looks like. So if you scroll over, you can see at the bottom, let's click it. It'll just load 0, 1, 2, and 3. It's not doing anything currently, but we are going to make it do something, right? So down here, let's specify a variable name, right? So we'll say, and you specify variable name with this ID. So question mark, we're going to call this ID is equal to I, right? So let's go ahead and refresh. So now it'll just append this question mark, and it's basically saying anything after this you can treat and you can grab, right? So we're going to be able to grab this ID. So let's go ahead and grab that ID, right? Again, we're doing everything in the same page just for the sake of doing stuff, right? Just for the sake of argument. And let's go ahead and open up PHP again. And we'll check to see if that value exists, right? So if is set, we want to see if the value exists technically, right? So if that variable exists, if is set, and then to retrieve items from the URL, you would basically use this universal variable called get, and the variable name that we decided to use, or the parameter, right, is ID. So if is set get ID, right, we're going to go ahead and echo contacts get ID. It's not very efficient, but we'll go ahead and basically say that, right? So what we're saying is if this parameter exists within the URL, we're going to go ahead and specify the value of that argument, which should be I, right, of some sort, 0, 1, 2, or 3. And we're going to pass it as an index to this contacts array. And we're going to go ahead and echo that out. All right, let's see what happens, right? Should just print out. And just so we can see what's being printed out, we'll append a little bit of HTML. So as you can see right here, we exited out, added HTML, embedded PHP. Right here, we're just putting everything as a string, because in the end, it's all going to be a string anyways. All right, so ID 1, if we click that, click that, click that. So there we go. The guy that said security risks, absolutely. These are huge security risks. But I'm just going to show you guys how some of this stuff can be done, right? Okay, enough of all this, right? We want cleaner code. We don't want to do this. This is just a nightmare to maintain. So people at the PHP community finally got the hint, and they allowed for object-oriented PHP, right? So we'll name this one test PHP, and right here we'll go ahead and do class. Let's just call it test, right? And within that class, you can start adding methods, right? So we'll do like a public function, execute something, and we'll be able to do some stuff, right? You know what? Let's construct that same page, but using classes, right? Let's go ahead and start public function. Let's just call it header. We're going to need the middle portion, right? Content and pubic public footer. So within the header, right, within the header function, we're going to just add some header stuff, right? So maybe everything up until there. We'll copy that. We'll paste it in there. And a little bit of embedded code, right? Next, content. Again, normally you wouldn't do this, right? I'm just trying to prove a point that you can't. You would, if you ever did something like this, it would be in separate files. You would instantiate that, et cetera, et cetera. Within the content, let's just go ahead and put in this H1 so that we can get into CodeIgniter pretty soon. And for the footer, we want to be able to close it, right? And of course, you would add your notes here. Include the footer or header, and et cetera, right? This does, like, if we were to go to this page right now, it would do absolutely nothing. So let's go to it. Let's go to test.php. And as you can see, it does nothing. In Java, to get this to run, you would say public static void main, you would pass string args, and it would be basically running that way. But currently for us, in PHP, there is nothing like that, right? So how do we get this to run? You have to instantiate the class and then call each one of these methods, right? So for example, object is equal to new test. By the way, before I continue, Java, PHP, completely opposite, right? So there is no return type, right? You can specify whether it's public, private, or protected, but you don't have to specify data types, even for your parameters, right? So for example, you can say header title, and you don't have to specify what it is. The other cool part is you can actually initialize the title right here in the parameter, right? So I'll go ahead and initialize it right there. And then I can say echo title, and it'll work, right? This right here, the PHP doc, is just saying this is missing if it wants to generate proper documentation for us afterwards, right? So that's all that is, right? You don't have to specify a data type. You can initialize it, and then later on, for example, if you were to call it header, you can specify or don't. Like, you don't have to specify what it is. It does get a little bit confusing, like, for example, what's being returned, if something's being returned. I mean, it can get confusing. That's why I always use documentation. Like, for example, if I was to return true right here, you can see right here it's telling me, hey, it's missing type, and I'll type in return bool, you know, so that it says, okay, this is being returned. Nope. But we won't do that. So let's go ahead and call the other ones. Object content and object footer, right? So now we've instantiated the test class. We've called each one of the methods, and you basically use this arrow to point towards which method you want to call. And if you want to specify, for example, in a header, since we do have an argument, you can or don't have to specify an argument. It's up to you. But let's see what happens when we refresh this page, right? So boom, there we go. Everything works now. If we inspect the source, well, guess what? No PHP, just HTML. If we go back, and let's specify this to some other guy. This little title that pops up right here, that's just saying, that's just a PHP storm saying, I didn't type that in. If we refresh, there we go, some other guy, right? If we refresh the same page, some other guy. So that's working. Now, I guess you know enough, hopefully, that we can go ahead and jump into doing CodeIgniter, right? So we definitely don't want to do stuff like this. I also don't want to write a lot of HTML code. That's why I said initially go ahead and go to that W3 schools, and we're going to be moving through this pretty fast right now, right? So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and delete these two files, and let's go ahead and get a little bit of an introduction to CodeIgniter, right? So CodeIgniter is an MVC framework. If you don't know any other meaning of any other architecture, at least know what MVC stands for, right? So MVC, right? We're just going to discuss that pretty quickly. MVC, Model View Controller. You're going to see this over and over again, and once you understand it, you're going to never want to go back to anything else, right? That's at least how I feel. It's just so much more structure, and I just don't understand why people find it so complicated. Maybe it's just that people just don't have good instructors where they can instruct them what it is. But anyways, we're going to go through a visual, right? So somebody types in example.com/index.php. Well, what happens, right? So imagine there's like a little signal that's being transferred. So it's going to some remote server, right? And on that server, it's trying to find this index.php page, right? So index.php. Most frameworks work like, along the same lines. So you're going to have this index.php page that's going to be able to direct traffic. Like, that's the best way I can think about it, right? So in that page, we just saw how we can, instantiate certain objects. That's basically what this is going to do in layman's terms, right? So the first thing that it's going to do is it's going to instantiate a class, right? Or an object or a controller. Why do we want to instantiate a controller? The controller is what basically receives that signal, right? So it's saying like, hey, we're on the index page, go ahead and instantiate the index controller, right? So this index.php knows, and I'll show you how it knows pretty soon, to go ahead and instantiate, for example, this index controller, right? An index.controller is just another class. So index.controller.php will have in it some kind of method, right? By default, if you have an index method, then you don't have to specify anything else, right? So in a lot of these MVC frameworks, they'll say something like, for example, about, where what it's doing is it's going to index.php, it knows to call this index controller, and a lot of the times, well, actually, this is going to call the about controller. Don't want to confuse you right now. So it's going to the default index method, right? We'll get into all this, everything else afterwards, right? So there can be a couple of more forward slashes. But within the index controller, what do we do, right? So now this is just an empty method. If we were to write something like echo hi, right? Right there, what it's going to do is it's just going to return echo hi, and hi is going to be displayed right there. But we want to be a little bit more structured, right? So most of the time, let's say on the index controller you have, I don't know, the latest projects, right? So in your, when you go to example.com/index.php, you have maybe like some kind of slider up top, and then, you know, well, actually, let's do top members, right? So you have a list of the top members, and then maybe a contact page or contact form down here at the bottom. Well, these top members, they're gonna be probably stored in a database, right? Most likely you didn't enter those right there. So what does index controller do? Well, it's gonna contact your model, right? So it's gonna contact the model. It's gonna instantiate the model right here. So let's go ahead and erase that echo hi. Let's make this a little bigger as well. And within, once it instantiates this model, right? So there's your model right there. It's going to maybe retrieve, or it says get, you know, this model has, it's just another class, right? So it's a model, and it has a method called get top members. Well, this get top members is going to be able to communicate with the database, right? The database is going to send an array of 3 top members, and that information is going to get stored in whatever, you know, variable, let's say members. All right, so it's going to get stored in this variable. At this point, now the index controller has a variable full of the top 3 members that were retrieved from the database, right? So that's all the model does. The model just communicates with the database. It'll do some more advanced code, like for example, if a user clicks on a submit form, usually I like to put the checks in a model and that kind of stuff, right? But if you really just want to oversimplify it, just think about it. A model is going to be modeling some kind of object, and that object is usually stored in a table, right, within the database. So once you retrieved that information, is going to be stored in members. So now what? Well, we can do, like for example, var dump members, and we can display it right there. Or if we want to make it nice, we can write a bunch of HTML code right here and just say, you know, for each members as member, echo member, right? So it'll display it, it'll return it, and it'll display it right here. But that can get quite messy quite quick. So we're going to want to pass, you know, this members data array to a view, right? So we pass that to a view, and a view again is just another file it's not going to be a class in CodeIgniter, it's just going to be HTML code. So there's some HTML code, and then you can embed a little PHP script tag, and you can just say, for each members as member, echo member, right? Close it, have your forward slash, backslash body tag, backslash HTML. So that view is basically what's displayed, what's returned to the server to right here. So just to recap, because this is kind of important, signal travels when somebody types in example.com/index.php, goes to the server, looks for that specific page. In this case, it's index.php, right? It's going to load the default controller, which is index controller. Within each controller that you're going to create, if you specify an index method, you don't have to keep going any additional forward slashes afterwards, right? And within that, since we do have to communicate, we have to retrieve some information from a database. Instantly database, you're going to think model. So let me go ahead and instantiate my model. We're going to get some top members. And this is another method that we created. It's going to go to the database. It's going to retrieve some of this information from the database. And it's going to store it in this members array. That members array is going to be pushed to a view. A view is just a file that contains a little bit of PHP code, for example, in our case, that knows how to output that, right? So in this case, members for each members as member, echo member. And now that gets pushed back, right? Or it doesn't get pushed back. I mean, it's just read because it's HTML code. But it'll come back through the server, and it'll come back to this person's laptop, and he's going to be able to see the HTML code. All right. So now, hopefully you guys were able to follow that, right? Let's go ahead and look at the default configuration. If you look at this, most of the time you're never going to do anything really with the system or the user guide. You're just going to be working in the application folder, right? So there are 3 folders, well, more than 3, that you're going to have to really get familiar with. One is the config folder, and we're going to go through a few of these files so that we can configure our application. Controllers, remember, once that signal comes in, it's going to come to a default index controller. And CodeIgniter, it's welcome.php, will show you how this can be changed, right? Because we don't always want welcome.php to be the default controller. The other folder that you're going to have to get familiar with is models. There is not a default model, so we're going to have to create that class ourselves. And the views folder, right? So as you can see, that output that was displayed is contained within this welcome message, right? So there that is. If we go ahead and remove, for example, most of this stuff, let's just go ahead and put hello. Let's go ahead and remove this last portion as well, right? Let's go ahead and we're going to be going to that home page. Welcome to Dino's tutorial, and hello there, right? So we're good. This is literally, let's look at what happens, right? How did it get there? CodeIgniter will send the default passage, right? That index without any additional URL parameters to this welcome method or welcome class. Remember, welcome class contains an index method, so we don't have to specify anything extra. And that index method, because it extends the CI controller, is able to utilize this. And then within this, you can load. And then you can load what? And we're going to be able to load a view. This knows to look in the views folder and look for a file called welcome message. It's not necessary to put in .php afterwards, right? let's go ahead and create something else down here. So let's go ahead and create about, right? So now it's not default index method. We're going to have the about method. And remember, I told you we can do whatever we want, but it's good to get accustomed to doing stuff like this, just because there are other frameworks that are a lot more strict that won't allow you to do stuff like this, right? But for the time being, we're going to go ahead and echo out hi. So where is that displayed, right? In order to get to that, in the default configuration, you're actually going to have to type in index.php and then go to about. Maybe. Oh, I'm sorry. You have to specify welcome, right? So in order to get rid of this file, you have to do a .htaccess file, which I won't go into it. But once you do, you would be able to enter something like that, which of course currently doesn't work because we don't have that .htaccess file to tell our Apache server what to do. Maybe in a later tutorial I'll show you how to get rid of this, but for the time being, just know that you're going to have to call the index.php file, which is CodeIgniter's default index.php file, which is this file right here. And don't do anything to this file, but like I said, this file knows what to do, right? It knows how to route it to welcome. So that is the same as, you know, what we just went in. It's the same as going to this welcome, right? If we want to get to a different method other than index, we can type in index, actually, it'll route it to index. But if we want to get to a different method, we'll have to specify that method. And with CodeIgniter, if we wanted to specify a URL parameter, right, that gets sent. So for example, let's say the number 2 gets sent, right? Currently nothing is popping up right there, but let's go ahead and print out this, whatever gets put in right here, right? So we'll go right here, and in the about method, you can specify a parameter, right? So we'll say, for example, number. So we can say echo hi number. That's it. Let's go ahead and refresh that. Hi, and then the number 2, right? I can put Dino right here, and I'll say hi Dino. So with CodeIgniter, it's a lot simpler, right? The framework automatically creates that for you, right? Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next step, right? So we're gonna wanna, like for example, the first thing I do is I want to get rid of this welcome and this welcome message, right? So what do? I go to config, and down here at the bottom is a file called routes. So routes just has a bunch of comments and the default controller. So as you can see, the default controller is set to welcome. For Java purposes, right, let's go ahead and change this to main. So now if we were to refresh, it would not work, right? So our application would not, well, actually it would work. Okay, it doesn't work. So the reason why that was working was because we actually told it to go into the welcome controller, right? But the default, it doesn't know where main exists. How can we correct that? Let's go ahead and open up our controllers, and let's go ahead and rename our welcome file into main, right? And here we'll also have to change the name of our class from welcome to main so that CodeIgniter knows how to route this properly. All right, let's go ahead and refresh. And as you can see, boom, we're back in business, right? So it knows how to get to that. So that's usually the first thing that I do. I'll also rename this, let's just call it main view, right? So now if we want to load it, we'll load it right there. We'll just specify the name of the file, which is main view. Let's refresh. Everything still works, right? Okay, a few other configuration things that we have to do. So one of the first things before that I click is this auto load, right? So auto load allows you to get a few different certain packages, certain libraries that CodeIgniter has built in. So some of the libraries that I get are, for example, the database library, an email, I use that a lot, and session, right? So if we want to create sessions, sessions, if you guys aren't familiar with it, are just a way to keep a variable, I guess, global, right? So that you can access it from many different pages. So we won't really get into sessions this time, but that's it for right now. The other thing that I like to know is just a few helpers, like for example, the URL helper and the form helper. I think that's it as far as auto load goes. The other one is config. So config our index.php page right here. We can go ahead and remove that once we do that .htaccess file, right? But currently we're just going to keep it there. And everything else, I believe, is pretty much standard on here. Yeah. The next one, the big one, since we enabled that database class, right? We're going to want to enable our, or we're going to want to put in some information right here. So if you just ran a clean install, your username or your host name is going to be localhost. Your username is going to be root. There's not going to be a password. And the database that we created earlier was called homepage, right? So let's just go ahead and refresh, make sure everything still works. And it does work, right? Okay, moving on. I know this is a lot of information, but these are usually the things that I like to go through. Well, we already covered routes, so I guess we're pretty much done as far as the configuration files go, right? So now we can actually start doing some other information, right? So let's go ahead and look at our main controller. We'll go ahead and delete this about method that we created earlier. And I guess it's time to start grabbing some of that information, right, from our CSS template. So if you haven't had a chance, just go to w3schools.com /w3css /w3css underscore templates .asp. Just grab a little bit of water. Okay. So now let's just go ahead and pick this top one, right? If we look at the demo, that's what it's going to look like. And most likely that's what we want ours to look like as well, right? Try it yourself. We'll give you the code. I'm just gonna Control A, Control X to grab all that. And I'll go back to my IDE. I'll open up my main view. And I'll pretty much delete everything except this define base path up here, which we won't cover right now. Most of this information, like for example, this bottom script, we don't need for anything, right? Let's get rid of Google Maps as well. Let's see what it looks like so far. So if we go and we refresh, okay, cool. There's just a couple of the images are missing. Let's look at what it's trying to do. Okay, so because it was hosted on their website, they just have a relative path /w3 images /that, which we don't have. The good part is we were able to get the CSS, so we're good to go. Let's go, you know, just for the sake, let's just save the image. You know what? I don't even care. No images. No images on this tutorial. Whatever. We just want to be able to move along. All right. So going back in here, well, I'm just going to clean this up a little bit more. This just setting a style, which we don't really care about. This is putting the navigation bar up top. This is if they go to a smaller screen. So if we inspect, you can click this right here, toggle device toolbar, and you can go ahead and inspect to see what it looks like on different screen sizes, right? You can actually even select, for example, iPhone 6, and that's that little, well, I deleted the JavaScript. Let's undelete it here at the bottom. So let's see, hopefully that fixed that issue. Inspect. Okay, yep. So there's just a little bit of JavaScript that caused this to expand, right? So I guess we'll keep the JavaScript at the bottom. All right, but I do want to get rid of this Google Maps, just so it's not in there. And I'll go ahead and remove the contact container, or maybe we'll keep the contact container. We'll remove it. And I'll remove the ticket model and the tour section. So we'll remove most of this stuff. We'll also get rid of this. Is this the automatic slideshow? Okay, since we don't have any images, we can get rid of that. And now it's starting to look a lot more manageable, right? Carousel, I'm assuming that's the automatic slideshow. Yep. All right, it says used to toggle the menu, so we want to keep that. When the user clicks anywhere outside the mode, it'll close it. Don't really care about that, right? And we'll rename it to whatever you want to name it to. So I'll name it to Dino Kajic, for example. Let's refresh. Let's make sure this thing still works. It does. All right, there we go. Now we have this, and we have the footer, right? If you guys ever wanted to just load up content, you can just search for lorem ipsum. And for example, right here, I want to generate 10 paragraphs, you know, and it'll just generate a bunch of just gibberish. I'm going to copy that. And in here, I'm just going to paste it. All right. So we've gone ahead and pasted that. Let's see if there it all is, right? Oh God, that looks messy. Maybe not that much. Maybe we'll just, instead of doing that, copy this. And refresh. All right, so now we have 3 paragraphs, right? I just wanted to kind of push this footer towards the bottom. That's why. All right, it has this little search, which was a modal, but now it's not. So let's go ahead and clean that up a little bit further. Fast search, and that's gone. Okay. Refresh, it's gone. So we have a pretty cool looking little website, the band, whatever, and technically, I mean, if you really wanted to, you can just keep going and going and going exactly like this. But we want to be neat, right? So if we're looking at the page, any other page that we create, this top header is going to stay the same, and this footer is going to stay the same. So let's go ahead and extract the header and the footer, right? So if we go over here, within our views, we'll create a directory, right? And we'll call those partials. And within partials, we'll create a PHP file. One's going to be called header.php, and the other one's going to be called footer.php. All right. Just want to make sure that I grab this just in case. And paste it in both of those, right? Let's start extracting. So what do we need? We're going to grab pretty much anything up here, all of this, There's the nav bar, which is conveniently named for us, and nav bar on small screens. So we can go all the way down here, and we can select all that information and just paste it in there, right? Yes, there are other ways to do this. Nav bar a lot of the times will be extracted and loaded separately, so you can do all kinds of fun new stuff. But for us, for this simple tutorial, we're just going to paste that information into this header.php file, right? All right, and then the footer, well, look at that. Footer is started off. All your JavaScript is usually placed at the bottom right before the closing body tag, just so it loads last. So we'll grab that, and we'll go ahead and basically paste that right there, right? If we were to go ahead and refresh this, all right, so all of that information is now messed up, right? So how do we fix that? Well, we'll fix it a couple of different ways. So the first thing we're going to do is right here, you can see that the main view is being loaded, but we're also going to want to have to include the partials, right? So load view, and because we created an additional directory within the views folder, we're going to have to make sure that it knows a path to get to that. So partials header and partials footer, right? All right, so now we've saved it. If we refresh, there we go, it's back to normal, right? We can inspect the source, boom, everything is loaded how it should be. What happened? Remember, the default controller main is being called. It goes to this index. It displays this partials header, right, first by calling or loading the view partials header, and it's located within partials / header. That file looks like this. Is just HTML code. Then the main view, and then the partials footer, right? So there we go. I mean, most of that is split up and good to go. If, for example, right, we wanted to pass a different title for every single page, it's going to be kind of difficult because this is statically typed right here, right now. So let's go ahead and make this a little bit more dynamic. These views can accept an additional parameter or two. One of those parameters is an array, right? So let's go ahead and create a data array, and we'll call, remember, in PHP you can have key value pairs. So this may look strange to some. You can just imagine this like, for example, a 0 or a 1, but we're going to be able to reference that. And CodeIgniter does some magic behind the scenes so that we can actually access this as a variable name. So data title is equal to, for example, Dino, right? We're going to be able to pass that data title to the header. And now, since it's in here, we can go ahead and echo title, right? I think that's what we named it. Echo title. Yep. So it should, once we refresh, change this from Dino Kajic to Dino, right? So boom, there we go. Same thing, remember? So now we're passing this information right here. So we can, remember when I was talking about loading models or loading content into an array from a model, we can pass that into wherever we want it to go, right? So let's go ahead and let's do that, right? So let's go ahead and create, let's create some kind of model, right? So in order to create a model, you know what, we'll just go it this way, right? I was going to create a database first, or a database table, but we'll just do it one step at a time. So we'll create a new model, and we'll call it contacts model.php, right? So within contacts model, we're just going to have to name it the same thing. And then, in order to utilize some of CodeIgniter's cool features, we're going to have to extend the CI model. So CodeIgniter comes with what's called Active Editor. And Active Editor is a way for you to be able to just use an object-oriented approach to SQL queries, right? So we'll get into that. So let's go ahead and create a method. So let's say get all contacts, right? And right here, we're not going to be connected to the database. We're just going to have a, data is equal to array, for example. And within the array, Kajic. Some other guy, I think is what I called last time. Frank Ramirez. I can't believe I remember this. Frank Ramirez, and I think it was Steven Johnson. All right. And what is this model? It's just going to return this data, right? So later on, we'll be actually loading that into this data variable and returning it that way, right? So if you wanted to get all fancy with your documentation, as you can see, once you initialize in PHP Storm your comments with a / asterisk, it'll automatically fill in some of this information for you, right? Okay, let's go back to main and let's separate this out. So this data title is Dino, right? It doesn't have to be called data. I mean, we can call, for example, this content. And within here, we'll just say contacts. Right? So content contacts is equal to this. Well, before we do that, we have to load the model, right? So this load model, and the model name is contacts model. Okay, most of the time, actually, by convention, you would want to, we're going to go ahead and rename that. So it's actually contacts underscore lowercase m for model, right? And we'll rename that as well to contacts model. So this load model, and we'll call it contacts model. And now you can do some weird stuff, right? You can, in PHP, you can say this contacts model. Oh, I was like, why is this highlighted weird? There we go. So you can say this contacts model and then call whatever you need to do. Like, for example, get all contacts, right? Call the get all contacts method. And we will, once that returns, store that into this content contacts element, right? We'll go ahead and pass that content array, right, into the main view. So just to kind of go over it again, we created a data title called Dino. We passed that data array into the header, and then header echoed out that title. Next, we loaded a model called contacts model. And then we used that contacts model to be able to access the get all contacts method. That get all contacts method within the contacts model just returned some data, and it passed it, or basically it returned it past the backend, and now we're storing it in the content array within the contacts variable, right? So here we go, we pass content into the main view. Well, main view hasn't done anything yet, so let's go ahead and take a look at, what do we name it? Contacts, right? PHPMagick is going to return convert this contacts into, let me take a look at the comments real quick. Notepad++, keep in Sublime text editor. Okay, so Sublime works. Yes, it does. Like I said, if you're a Georgia State student, I think most students, you can go to jetbrains.com and you can use your student email and you're going to be able to get this editor for free. So just an FYI. All right, so we retrieved that. We saved it into here. We passed it here. And remember, CodeIgniter through magic is going to convert this into a contacts variable, right, that we can access. So let's go to main view. And here at the bottom, I'm just going to go ahead and say, I'll put in a new P class is equal to W3 justify, for example. That's just a class name for CSS, right? And we'll put in a little bit of PHP code, and we just say, since the information that's being returned, remember, is an array. So once it's returned, this element is also an array, right? It just stores this data right there. So now when we pass it, we're passing an entire array of data into the main view, right? So we can say for each contacts as contact echo. Now, for example, we can put all of these like H1 contact. And let's see what happens, right? Cross our fingers, hope everything works. Boom, right? So there they all are, right? Okay, the last real big portion that we're going to want to cover is how do we get this information from a database? How do we insert it into a database? So let's go ahead and create that, right? So let's go ahead and log into our database. And within homepage, we're going to create a new table called contacts, right? Number of columns, let's just put 2, right? So the first one that we're going to call is ID, and the other one name, right? Very terrible, terrible table. But the ID column, if you've taken any kind of SQL, can be auto-incremented, right? We're going to set an attribute of unsigned just because we don't need any negative numbers for this integer. And it's going to be the primary, right? So when we insert something, we don't have to specify which ID it's going to be automatically incremented. For name, we're going to specify that as a varchar. And we're going to say the user can enter up to 255 characters, right? Save it. And now we have a contacts table, right? So there's our contacts table structure. If we browse, there's nothing in there. But we can go ahead and insert something, like for example, Dino Kajic or Stephen Johnson. And this is just manually through PHPMyAdmin if you want to do that. So remember, I didn't specify any IDs, but because it's auto-incremented, it will actually insert the IDs right there. Okay, let's go ahead and see if we can retrieve those, right? This is the scary part. So we'll get rid of this data and we'll start using the active record. So right here, this is where you would connect to the database in normal PHP applications. You would retrieve the data from the database and then return it, right, from this method. With CodeIgniter, you've entered all the configuration files to be able to connect to the database inside your config database, right? You've also loaded, I believe it's an auto load, your database library. So we are good to go, right? So right here, you specified all the different configurations for your database. Let's close that out. And to get all contacts, we'll use this. It gets access to DB because it's extended the CI model. And we're gonna select all, right? So this is the object-oriented await. This is the same thing as saying select all from, or actually, we have to build the rest of that. So select all, right? The next thing is we have to specify from where, right? Well, we know that it's inside the which database, right? Which is our home page. And then we just have to specify which table. So in our case, it's going to be contacts. All right. The next thing we have to say is, for example, this is where you can do like a where ID is greater than 2, where name is equal to Kajic or whatever. But in our case, we don't really care, right? So that's all. Select all from contacts. All right. Next thing, let's go ahead and do this query, right? So this DB, and we're going to call get. So it's going to go and get that, right? And we're going to want to we're going to want to actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and do a where, right? This DB where ID is equal to 1. Just for fun, right? I was debating whether to do it or not, but let's go ahead and do it. So once we go ahead and execute that, it's going to retrieve it, and then we're going to be able to get that entry by calling query row. All right, let's see what happens so far, right? So remember, we can go ahead and var dump that row. If we go back to main, right here is where we're calling get all contacts. I'm just going to go ahead and copy that. I can't remember, I think it's, nope. Control / there we go. And I'm going to, well, we need to also load our model right there. So we're loading our model, we're calling the get all contacts. It's not returning anything at this point. We're just dumping out the row, right? So let's see what it dumps out. Go back over here and refresh. There we go, it returned ID of 1 and it returned the name, right? All right, so now all we have to do is specify return row, and it's going to return that row. If we go back to our controller where we're calling this, right, let's go ahead and undo that. Now that ID gets passed back, or that array gets passed back, and it is passed from the contacts model into this array right here. This array gets passed into the main view, and the main view should be able to do something with it, right? So again, we can keep this for each contact as contact, and then let's see what that looks like, right? So we don't really know what contact looks like at this point, even though I do, because I can just look at this right here. But the first thing is 1, and the second one is a string, right? So since we're returning that right there, we could just actually, we don't even need a for each statement. We could just say echo contacts. And I think, let me double check. I think we're going to be able to call it by the key that it was returned initially. So no. So it says cannot use object. Oh, okay, it's returning an object. So let's see if we can call it this way. Yep. All right, so it's actually returning an object, right? In which case, once we retrieve that object, we have to specify, or we're going to be able to access certain properties, right? So a little bit different than an array, but I'm sure you guys get the picture, right? Okay, let's see what else can we do, right? Maybe inserting something into the array, right? Let me just see. All right, so let's say we want to, I'm trying to think if we should create a form. I might as well create a little form, right? So we can just go through that whole process. So let's go ahead and create a form. And a form will allow us to go ahead and communicate or send variables like data to wherever, right? So in our case, to the database. All right, so the form requires a method. It requires a post method. So we're going to be sending data via post. When we're retrieving it from the URL, we were using the GET request, right? And the action is going to be, where are we? We're in the main view, right? So it's going to be this view. So how do we get to that view? We can actually utilize, since we loaded initially the URL helper, we can say echo base URL. And that should just output the location to this main view. All right. Let's go ahead and just type in input type is equal to text to put in a text. Name we'll specify as, I don't know, contact name. And we'll go ahead and do a submit button, right? So just very simple. Input type is equal to submit. Name is equal to, we'll name it the same thing, right? So that we can retrieve that, submit. And value is equal to submit name. So this is what's going to be displayed to the user, right? So submit name. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. All right, so there's the name field and a submit name. If we inspect that, we're going to be able to see our form. So right here, you can see that it's going to that base URL, right? Our input type is equal to text, contact name, input type submit. If we wanted our form to be handled by a different method, we can do that too. So maybe let's go ahead and do that, right? Let's get it handled by something else. So instead of it being handled by this index method, we'll go ahead and create a new method to handle it. So public function handle form, right? So you can name this whatever you want. So that's what's going to be called, right? So now we have to specify that that is in fact what's going to be called. So right here in base URL, remember we're going to index.php /main /handle form, because it's content, or it's located inside our main method, and there's our handle form, right? So for testing, we'll just say echo hello. And let's go ahead and refresh. If we click submit, as you can see, it went to that main handle form and it just displayed hello, right? But we want to be able to capture this information, right? So let's go ahead and capture it. So I believe it's this input. Is it this post? No. Let's look at the documentation, right? I switched through so many different frameworks. CodeIgniter.com, documentation, read the user guide online. Even better, CodeIgniter, get post. All right, let's look at that. So it's saying, oh, it is input. All right, so this input, whatever. So this input, we're going to be requesting a post, and the name that we gave to our input tag right here is contact name. So we're going to want to retrieve that. And we'll store that in a variable called name. So let's just make sure that works. Echo name. Come back over here, refresh, and now if I enter, like for example, Steven, there we go. It's being printed out, right? We're good. Submit Steven, Steven J, even everything's good. All right, so this is where you would do a little bit of extra validation, but we're not going to, right? We're gonna want to insert this information into our cart, right? So we're gonna, or not our cart, our context model. So this load model, context model, and this context model. And did we create anything? We haven't. So let's go ahead and create a function, public function, add contact, and we're going to pass a variable name. All right, so add contact name, right? So add contact and name, and that's what we're passing through. So again, let's make sure it works. Echo hello dot name. So it's just coming here. At this point, we just want to make sure our logic is sound. Steven Johnson. Hello, Steven Johnson. So it's mated to the model at this point. All right, we're almost done. This one is actually pretty simple, right? So with this, you just say this db insert I'm trying to think. I think the first parameter is the name of the table. What do we name it? We named it contacts. Okay, so this db insert contacts name, right? So let's see, and then we'll return, for example, true, right? You'll say, like, initially you'd say, like, oh, if this was successful, return true, otherwise we'll return false. But for this instance, we're going to go ahead and return true. But echo made it. Let's see if it works, right? All right. Boom. Dino Spumoni, submit. All right, check the manual. So, insert into contacts, Dino Spumoni. All right, so it's unknown column Dino. What are we missing? Oh, I know what we're missing. Okay, this name actually has to be part of an array that gets inserted, right? So we're going to call this data name is equal to name. Now the name is a field within our table. So if we go here, there's the name, so we're going to want to insert into name a specific thing, right? And then we're going to pass that data. So insert into contacts data. So let's see, hopefully that works. I don't think I forgot anything else. All right, made it. Now let's go ahead and refresh. All right, there it is. So now we have a way to add something and retrieve something from the database. Now active record comes with a way to update, to delete, all kinds of stuff. So I think it's like this db delete from contacts, and then you specify, for example, an ID, right? So where ID is equal to 2. And that's it. Just a quick review, right, of CodeIgniter. A person will come to the default page. Let's actually do this. So it'll come to, a person will come to the default page. The default CodeIgniter index.php knows how to get to this main method or main class. And how does it know? Well, inside a configuration, inside routes, you specified main. Initially it was welcome, we changed it to main, right? So here we go. We're here inside our main controller. Now, if, for example, let's say you were creating an about page or contact page or band page, you would have different controllers for each one of those, right? And then you would access those controllers by going to /index.php / for example, band. And then band would be triggered by going to controllers and then band.php class band, right? So anyways, on the default page, you're coming over here, it's going into main, it's going to the default index method. CodeIgniter looks for this default index method. You're going to create a data array, and it's going to have a key title, and that key is going to have a value of Dino, for example, in this case. It's going to get passed to this partials header. So if we go to views partials header, it gets passed into this file. Now this just contains the top portion of the HTML file, everything up until right after the navigation bar up top. Through the magic of CodeIgniter, the title key gets converted into a title variable, and we're able to display that right there. So now, the next thing that we're doing is we're loading the context model, and we're retrieving all of the contacts. Well, I guess we're retrieving one contact in our instance, but that's easily changeable. So we're retrieving one contact, and we're storing it into this content contact. So inside our context model, within get all contacts, we're selecting all from contacts where ID is equal to 1. So that's what that query makes. So we're retrieving it, storing, getting the row, and then returning that row. So once that information is returned, this row is actually an object, and that object is returned and stored within this content array under the contacts key, right? So this content array that contains, I realize, goodness gracious, there's a lot of terminology, hopefully everybody could follow me. So this content array contains this object, and that gets pushed into the main view, right? Which is just located under views, main view. So that main view is able to access that object. Remember, CodeIgniter converts contacts key into contacts variable. And because it is an object, we have to access the name property through this little arrow. Okay. So it just displays it, and there it is right there. That's what's basically displayed. Next is the footer. Well, actually, within the main view, we're also creating this form. Because of our URL helper class, we can use this base URL and say what we want once we press the submit name button. What do we want to handle this submission request, right? So something like that, right? You're gonna be able to click on that. It's gonna go to this handle form that's located within this main controller. All right, so let's say we did click the button, and it's going to go to handle form, right, within our main controller. The first thing that it's going to do is we're going to retrieve the contact name from this field. So this is sent via post to the server, and the name of that input field was contact name. So we retrieved it and we stored it in this name variable. We load our contacts model because we need to pass that name variable into the contacts model, specifically the add contact method. And as you can see, added contact accepts that name argument, and it stores it into an array called data. The reason why we need that is because we have to specify, I understand this is a little bit redundant, name, but within our table, our contacts table, we named one of the columns name, so we have to match that column name right here. We call this command, this db insert into contacts data. So this will just say insert into contacts name, key or goodness gracious, I'm starting to forget it, SQL, but into the name field all the different values, right? So for example, if we had other fields, like for example ID, we could specify data ID is equal to whatever, and then once we move that, it will say values 1, or Dino, whatever we pass to it. And we're echoing out meta right here. This is probably not a good thing to do. We want to return some kind of either true or false, into here, and then from here you're going to want to contact or call a different view, right? So if this is successful, go ahead and call some kind of success message view, right? And that's it. We've gone ahead through a lot today, almost an hour and 41 minutes worth. So I really hope that this was helpful. Later on, I had this open just to kind of show you guys. You're going to be able to do something a lot more complex, right? So this is something I actually did for school. Web programming course. I did this rental car e-commerce website. Here's something like the login controller. As you can see, it's a lot more complicated. The login model. There are a lot more different things happening. This is, for example, the cart model. There are a ton of stuff, like for example, initializing cart session, add items to session, update total cost, get cart items, remove from cart. We want to check if available, get credit cards, insert order. So the insert order, as you can see, there's a lot of configuration, but eventually you will be able to do that kind of stuff, right? So as you can see, there are all kinds of different views. There are not, of course, as many models. I created this validation model where I can validate email, validate name, validate phone, street. Make sure to keep your regular expressions in memory. You'll be using them always. Zip, even password, for example. We encrypt a password into a password hash algorithm from PHP. Loon check, which is like a credit card mathematical check to see if everything is correct. Validate CVV, for example. See all the different controllers. So, like, there are, like, for example, a contact controller, admin controller, where they can log in, view sales history, register. So there's that registration. I actually did the registration right there, where I'm checking input. If this is not present, executing some of that. There's all the check input, validation to make sure that everything is secure. But like I said, I understand we were rushing through some of this stuff, so we didn't, of course, get a chance to implement a lot of this stuff. But if you literally just follow the same structure what we did right here, all of a sudden your applications start getting larger and larger, and eventually you're just able to create some pretty cool stuff. But anyways, I think that's it for me. Hey, look, I'm back. Now I'm not blocking the top left portion of the screen. And yeah, I'll see you guys, the guys that are from Computer Science Club. I'll see you guys Thursday, and we can discuss our, I guess, next portion of creating the Computer Science Club website. So, all right, see ya.